Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Christy Bird, and I am part of the Division 15 Race and Diversity Committee. And on behalf of the committee, I want to welcome you to our session, the role of educational psychology in challenging the CRT backlash in schools. So we have a really exciting panel for you today. But before we get started the panel, I want to tell you about our in-person session that's going to be on Saturday in person at APA. So in this session, we're going to be talking about strategies to address the attacks on critical race theory as educational psychologists. So we really hope you join us for that session as well. The Race and Diversity Committee in the last couple of years has been really thinking about ways that we can make sure that educational psychologists are able to discuss issues regarding race and diversity as in our title, but we're really focused on thinking about what does it mean to be in this field and also to be concerned with these issues. So I'll just say that we did some great sessions last year, which you can find on the Division 15 website. And then this year we have this wonderful panel for you. So for our panel today, we have Dr. Nolan Cabrera, who's an associate professor in the Center for the Study of Higher Education at the University of Arizona. Adriana Aldana is an associate professor in the Department of Social Work at California State University, Dominguez Hills. Alon Hope is Program Area Director for Research and Evaluation at Policy Research Associates. And our moderator, Jamal Matthews, is an Associate Professor in Educational Studies and the Combined Program in Education Psychology at the University of Michigan, Go Blue. And so I will turn it over to him to start our panel since we have such a short amount of time with you all today.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Christy, for that introduction. Can everyone hear me? Good to go. Okay, great. Yeah, so my name is Jamal Matthews. I have the privilege of moderating today's discussion. I really want to maximize, the very short amount of time that we have with our panelists today. So we'll jump into that discussion in a quick moment. However, to frame the discussion, I just wanted to begin with a quote from James Baldwin here on the screen. So open quote, "I picked the cotton. I brought it to the market. I built the railroads under someone else's whip. For nothing, for nothing." End quote. So I'm sure many of us know James Baldwin, as a great American writer and activist of the 1960s and 70s, who himself, never experienced slavery directly. However, for this quote, his first person usage of having picked the cotton, of having built the railroads, is really a critique of his own country that's developed its economic wealth and standing in the world off of the backs and the blood of Black slaves, yet continues to relegate Black Americans to second-class citizenship nearly 400 years later. So although never literally a slave, his comments speak to the tangible ripple effect that this country's original sin has had on the condition and experiences of Black Americans throughout its history. And we know that these conditions are now systemic and continue to persist even in 2022. So in essence, this is really what critical race theory seeks to bring into clear perspective for us today. It highlights how racism and the exploitation of Black people and other people of color are endemic to our society to such a degree that we need explicit instruction on it just to be able to identify and understand it. And our hope in teaching our kids about this history is that we can begin to truly heal as a country and not perpetuate some of the mistakes of the past. However, at the same time, we know that, as discussions of CRT have taken center stage in the past 2 years, there's been significant whitelash in response. So our panelists today are going to discuss some of these issues, their conceptions of CRT, the debates on CRT education and anti-CRT legislation, and then some of their perspectives on the potential for educational psychology to contribute to this discussion. So with that, we're just going to jump straight into the questions. For this first question, it'd be great if everyone could respond to this first question. And it's pretty straightforward. Can you describe your conceptions of CRT and the ways that you use CRT to inform your own research and practice? How do you explore the impact of race and or racism on teaching and learning processes?
I'm going to be a bit of an oddball in this group because my research and my work is really oriented in critical whiteness studies. And I don't want to say that they're opposed. I think that they're very complementary areas of study. But this is going to be a bit of a gross oversimplification, but just bear with me. That if we're talking about critical race theory, a lot of times we're talking about amplifying voices of color, marginalized peoples, and the experiences of the harm that systemic racism and white supremacy have caused on peoples of color broadly defined throughout the history and contemporarily. For me, critical whiteness is a complement to it in the way that it sort of unveils the inner working machinery of how white supremacy operates. So it's sort of looking at sort of the cause that leads to the effect that CRT is very much rooted. And so that's sort of how I try to orient my work. Now, again, does that mean CRT doesn't theorize white supremacy? Absolutely not. And so I'm creating a false binary, but then it allows it to sort of merge together like that. So if we see whiteness and white supremacy as the problem, I really look into that inner workings to then understand how the harm is perpetuated and how it's systemically ingrained in society.
I'll go ahead if Ilan doesn't want to speak next. And I also have a caveat. I'm coming from the perspective of social work and social work education specifically, although my training is in educational psychology, and a lot of my research with young people, particularly in kind of youth participatory action research spaces, is dealing with how do we think about race in a structural way. But when I'm kind of wearing my social work educator hat, one of the ways that I teach my students, who often are working with youth and families in different contexts, not just schools, but community-based organizations, grassroots movements, I explain to them that in the way that I'm conceptualizing CRT as this analytical tool that gives us both the language and the critical analysis that we need to identify some of that entrenched racism and white supremacy that we were speaking about in the introduction. The other way that I really like to kind of conceptualize it in the teaching and learning, I think to Nolan's work around CRT as a theorizing space, right? And then often one of the questions that I get from my students is like, this is wonderful. This is validating my experience. I am starting to be able to name experiences and how it relates back to systemic racism, but how do I use it in practice? What does this look like when I'm working with youth or when I'm working with clients or when I'm doing therapeutic interventions? And in that regard, one of the things that I talk to my students is CRT is not currently an intervention theory. Social workers, we love to have our intervention theories, our intervention models, and how are we going to apply that? And so I say, again, it's an analytic framework. It's an analytic tool for you as social workers, as practitioners working with youth and families. Think of it as, well, I like to use the term sazon, or that secret ingredient in your practice that gives you an added layer of effectiveness. Because if you're not thinking about race in the context of people's lives in the US, you're missing a big part of the picture. So that's kind of in a nutshell the way that I'm thinking about CRT.
And I'll join my colleagues and kind of say yes. And for me, I even think that I was incorporating CRT into my research before I even knew what CRT was. Right, but that as an analytic frame, as an analytic tool, as a theoretical way to look at the world and name how, when, why race matters in the US. And so that's kind of the overarching way that I think I use CRT in my work. And in particular, I study how kids understand racism, right? So not just how it affects them, but literally, how do they articulate, understand, process the interactions that they're having in their lives, the observations they're making in their communities, their experiences in schools. And so it's almost quite meta, right? Like, so how do kids even understand what are inherently some of the components of critical race theory? How do they come to develop their own critical understanding of race and racism, or if and when do they choose not to engage in that kind of thinking? And then in relation to schools and classrooms and learning, how then do teachers, the adults, staff, parents engage that process as well with students or not, right? Because whether you're actively engaging it, the absence of engagement is a form of engaging in the conversation around what race and racism mean for folks in the US, and particularly the intersectionality component. What does it mean for different folks as they're experiencing across class, gender, sexuality, other experiences, and particularly in education context, right? Thinking about ability, disability in schools. So it's an interesting question for me to think about, because I think before I could name CRT, it was part of my own critical understanding of race and racism, is to understand the structures and ways that race matters in our everyday lives.
Wonderful. I appreciate the blend of answers there. I think one of the patterns or things that I see even coming out of that first set of answers is CRT as a theorizing space, as you mentioned, Adriana, similar to what you were saying, Ilan, in terms of like it being meta, but then also there being a tension there of like figuring out how to bring this down to the ground level, to a practical level, so that youth, researchers, educators can engage in actions around some of these ideas. I'm just gonna also circle back to Nolan, and it's really interesting. You talked about your work in critical whiteness studies as a complement to CRT. Just wondering if you could say a little bit more on that, and maybe just give us a sense of like how that plays out in your research and your work.
Absolutely. So in higher education in particular, one of the most common forms of critical race theory analysis is the microaggressions and sort of the everyday manifestations of white supremacy and interpersonal interactions on a base level that relates to the structure of white supremacy. Well, if we're talking about microaggressions, there's a very specific dynamic that you have a structure of white supremacy. You have a microaggressee, but you also have to have a microaggressor. And so critical race theory has done an excellent job at explaining the experiences, the tensions, the racial battle fatigue that is experienced by the microaggressee, but has not explored the microaggressor. And it's not that the microaggressor really is trying to be overtly racist, but they are. It's so ingrained in society that a lot of times white people act racist without even really thinking about it. And so a lot of the critical whiteness work sort of uncovers these unconscious biases. And I don't like thinking about it. I need to use a different terminology, because bias, prejudice, it tends to individualize racism. But it's almost like racism and white supremacy becomes so normal to them that they don't even realize when they're engaging it. And so then you end up not just with the initial issue of the microaggressee, microaggressor, but then in the subsequent discussions around it, when we're talking interpersonally, then you have frequently what J. Luke Wood and Frank Harris refer to as race lighting, where white people will engage in this concept, will engage in this, well, is it really racist? What's really going on? Did you really perceive it as normal? So a very specific white version, race-based analysis of gaslighting. And so in many respects, my dear friends and colleagues, J. Luke Wood and Frank Harris, will talk about how people of color experience race lighting. My work will shed some light on why is it that some people are engaging in this in the first place? What are the structural realities and unconscious habits that lead people to go about doing this, that create the racial harm that folks are experiencing on this level? So, and I mean, I can go on and on and on, but I think that the microaggressions example is kind of an easy one to wrap your head around, so that you see how there's dynamics that we explore kind of one side and think that we've understood the whole thing. And so critical whiteness can kind of round out that analysis, and it can get to a lot of different areas like that.
Excellent. Thank you for providing that extra detail. So transition to the next question. So, race, in particular CRT, or critical race theory, has been polarized in debates, about what children should be learning in schools. And we've seen this specifically within the past 2 years. So based on your all years of experience of exploring and researching, the different facets of teaching and learning, what's your position on the debate? How should researchers in education and psychology and educational psychology, be responding, to the series of debates? We got to switch up the order this time.
I'm gonna respond, but I'm not sure if I'm gonna directly answer the question, and hopefully my colleagues can build on what I say. I think the first thing that comes to mind for me, one is that this polarization is not surprising because we're challenging a dominant system of oppression. And so that resistance is expected. And it's also resurfacing. It's happened in the past. The other thing that comes to mind, one of the fallacies that I see in opponents of CRT or teaching about race in schools is that we are teaching about race in schools, often in very problematic ways that ignore the truth of white supremacy and racism in this country, even outside of like the current debate and polarization. I think some of the work that Dr. Christy Bird has done around racial climate and racial socialization in schools teach us, right, that whether or not schools and educators are aware that they are transmitting racial attitudes, beliefs, understandings to children and youth, it's happening. And so for us, I think it's important to be intentional, to critically examine what are the messages that we are providing for students. How are we preparing them to be conscientious, critical citizens, and how they're going to participate in a democracy that is diverse and that does have inequalities? So for me, I think kind of laying that as a foundation to the conversation of what's happening today and how should we be addressing it.
Yeah, I'll, jump in off of that because that's been my hiccup, right, so to speak, is that we are teaching about race in schools, but from whose perspective and with who in mind. And, I've had folks, well, if I ask kids about racism, won't it make them uncomfortable? I said, well, imagine experiencing it, right? Well, doesn't that make them uncomfortable, right? So the least we could do is ask them about their experiences in efforts to try to make their environments better and more productive for their well-being. And so we're teaching about race through curriculum. We're teaching about it through interactions. It's happening in schools. And so this idea that we can legislate to not teach about race is erroneous from the beginning. And it's really legislation around what to teach about race that reinforces white supremacy. And so I think that kind of answers part one of your question. I guess what I would love to see researchers do, I've talked to some folks who are in some states that have very, very strong active legislation, right? The Brennan Center just put out a paper article in 538 that outlined all the legislation that's happened so far and which states have enacted what bills are kind of just sitting out there. It's a great article that kind of breaks it down for folks. And so it's happening all across the United States. Some states are further along than others. But as researchers, even when you're in those states and in those school districts, document even just basic student outcomes, right? Because at the very least, what we're doing, even if we're not able in those schools to ask the questions we'd love to ask, we are still able to document overall general kind of trends and well-being for students. And we can kind of have those time series analyses, right? We can have a pre and post legislation, right? We can have data at the very least as researchers. I think we kind of have the skill set to document how this is happening in history, particularly when we have these ongoing relationships in schools. Maybe you wanted a racial climate measure in there, and maybe they're scared to put it in there because of the legislation, but we can still look at mental health outcomes, grade outcomes, right? We can look at a host of other outcomes in the context of the legislation. I think as psychologists, sometimes we get really focused on the individual, but putting it in the context of history, which is, what's happening now, we can say a lot about how these are failing our kids. I would confidently hypothesize that we will be able to say these are failures to our kids.
So I'm gonna go way out of left field on this one, but just bear with me on this. I'm also talking from like, y'all ever seen that movie Groundhog Day where he just wakes up and it's the same thing over and over? Okay, so like I'm coming out of Arizona, and this legislation, like it feels like I woke up and I'm back in Arizona in 2010 where they were banning Mexican American studies. And so from that perspective, I want to lovingly but kind of assertively push back against even the basic premise of the question, because I don't believe we're actually engaged in a debate right now. I believe that this is actually a form of propaganda, and by identifying it as such, it requires a different set of tools to address it. Because I was on the phone with a reporter yesterday about this issue, and the person said, well, like, look, if what you say is true, that critical race theory isn't really taught that much in K-12 schools, what's the problem with a banning at all, right? And I thought of two things off the top of my head. One, the devil's in the details, that once this is enacted, it becomes a way to twist the truth and say, like, anything that's race conscious is a form of critical race theory, which is really what we're talking about, because we're not really talking about critical race theory. It's a perversion, it's a distortion. And we as academics have a tendency to be like, well, no, our goal as truth seekers is to reveal the truth. This is the truth about critical race theory, etc. What we forget is that there is a truth that this is propaganda that is being enacted, that is trying to do harm, because at its core, the base question is this. It's not whether or not critical race theory should be taught in our schools. My second point is the real question, the core of what we should be talking about here is, why are we even entertaining the idea of banning, of censorship? Because that's the core of what we're talking about here. And remember, it's not, if it was Mexican American studies and then it became ethnic studies on a national level, now it's critical race theory, then it'll be, and also remember, it's not coincidental that this is happening during a midterm election cycle. The Republican Party has been doing this for the last 2 decades consistently. Back in the early 2000s, it was gay marriage and immigration. Now it's critical race theory and trans girls in sports. It's these wedge issues that you throw legislation at to drive your base up in the polls, in where there's low turnout in the midterm elections. Harm is done, and then they find the next solution instead, in search of a problem later on. And so I think if we're talking about truth as academics, a huge part of what we have to do is call out the existing lies and propaganda and be very clear that that's what we're talking about here. And I love these teachings. I love where we're setting the record straight on what critical race theory is, how it's manifest, and all these things. So please don't think that I'm trying to talk mess about this gathering. I really love and respect being part of this discussion. But I think if we stay in our kind of our ivory tower mindset, that we lose the larger perspective, that by even engaging in that debate in the larger view, in some ways we're even entertaining that censorship should even be entertained at all. And it's not. That's why we're not in a debate. We're not in an honest discussion, and we need to be able to label it as such. All right, I'll get down off my high horse, but I've got about 15 years of pent-up frustration over this.
Yeah, so really, really interesting comments there. And I'm actually going to invite Adriana and Alon to even just circle back into responding to some of that. A lot was said. Some cross-cutting themes I see between Nolan and Adriana is around, like, this is not new. Like, this is cyclical in nature. This has happened, so many times before. But also, Nolan's point about us as researchers to come down from the ivory tower, number one, but us as researchers not truly being engaged in the debate. So yeah, just want to re-invite Adriana, Alon back in if you want to comment on any of that, or how as researchers do we get engage in debate in a way that is, that's real and authentic and can promote truth.
Thank you for having us circle back. A few things came to mind. One, I think Alon gave us a couple of potential strategies as researchers, and then I want to maybe speak to some of the comments that Nolan brought up. One is, as researchers, especially psychological researchers, we tend to think very individually. So what are the individual outcomes for youth, or individual factors that are affecting individuals? And so I think, to Nolan's point about identifying what this really is, that this is propaganda, that this is a movement towards censorship and suppressing truth, that we're going to need to study macro systems. We're going to need to study how social movements at a collective level can be effective in addressing the reality that we're in right now. And also, Alon mentioned, we can study the outcomes of the current policies, right? So again, thinking about when we do suppress truth, when we are engaging in censorship, what are the outcomes for youth? Because we have some of that. And again, not just at the individual level, but at the collective and systemic level, about the ways that it's maintaining white supremacy and racism. And then I think too, to Nolan's point, we need to do some more, and this is more at the higher ed level, of training future scholars to be actively engaged in activism and politics. We are not trained in that way. We're trained, specifically for those of us who are in PhD programs, to be academics, to be in the ivory tower, to be thinking and theorizing about this stuff, and not necessarily thinking about the ways that we advocate for the communities that we're studying or that we are engaging in research with. And so that, I think, is another piece for me. Finally, then I'll kind of move on. The tenet of interest convergence came up for me in terms of critical race theory. Derek Bell mentions that in social movements, advancements in civil liberties and civil rights, specifically for Black and other folks of color, aren't going to happen out of the goodness of people's hearts. That there has to be some invested interest in the dominant group, in the power players, in decision makers, in order for things to change. And so I think, whether this is a debate or not, if we want to protect the right to teach truth to children around issues of race and racism, there's going to have to be some strategic thinking of, again, what's in it for all of us? What's in it for folks of color? What's in it for those in power? Because just saying this is the right thing to do is unfortunately not going to work.
And I'll just add, Nolan, I appreciate your comments, because interesting fun fact about me is that when I was in high school, I had the opportunity to participate in a program called Bringing the Lessons Home, sponsored by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And it was a program where they brought mostly Black kids from DC and surrounding suburbs to learn about the Holocaust, and in particular partner with churches in the South who had been victims of hate crimes in the South. And it was an opportunity where we learned about the similarities, right? So when y'all are talking about this is history repeating itself. And so when you speak about propaganda, when you go into the Holocaust Museum, on the 4th floor, it starts on the 4th floor and goes down. And so you go to the 4th floor, and one of the first sets of exhibits is before Kristallnacht, before any of the overt official dates of the Holocaust, was all the propaganda for kids. It's cases of books, it's cases of school materials, it's cases of dolls, it's cases of toys that are propaganda supporting the Nazi regime, and how that propaganda was used to create fear and to create ideology among kids, right? That would sustain that ideology in the broader community. And it wasn't just ideology for the kids who were on the receiving end, right? But it's ideology for everyone. So it's what everybody's internalizing about who is worth what in society, right? And so I just bring that up because I think often, right, people think of the Holocaust as so atrocious and how could that happen and how could it happen again? And if you look at history and you study even how curators of history are putting together exhibits, it starts with the propaganda. And so I appreciate that framing and calling it what it is, because I think it helps us emphasize the severity. And like you said, to target, right, then how do you combat when it's not just, but when you can think about it beyond legislation and truly as, education for what it is. It's a way to teach people how you want them to be and feel and do and learn in a space. It's what we do, right, as people. And so I don't really have too much more to add, but I just always, and I think that's part of why, as a researcher, when that first question, Jamal, you asked, right? I think I've been doing CRT before I knew what to call it CRT because of experiences like that, where you look, and in particular, it was interesting. They had kids. I was the kids, right? Had kids. We were docents in the museum, so we train all year long, and over the summer we'd work. And our target audiences were police and teachers. We would walk groups of police and teachers through the museum to teach these lessons of history and race and racism, in particular to teachers and police, right? And so we think about the current day legislation is focusing on education and criminal legal systems, right? And I think it's not a coincidence, and that as researchers, we can keep that in mind as we go about even understanding individual difference and understanding individual outcomes, that we are in a much broader system and we have a lot of examples. This is just one I know personally because I was taught it very explicitly. And I think that's also why we need to fight back against it, right? Because when you're taught it very explicitly, I have a lot of peers who also went through, we each took different things from the experience, but it's by no coincidence that I'm sitting here today talking to y'all today with that history and that being part of my education.
I appreciate that round of remarks, and also Alon, your offerings around your experiences there, really powerful. So in about 10 minutes or so, we're going to transition to a Q&A. So if there are folks from the audience who have questions, I think you can submit those in the chat function. I might ask for a little help from Christy to help monitor that chat function, just to make sure I don't miss something. But we'll transition to the next question, and that is, given the climate that we described, and that our panelists have spoke to, how can we prepare future teachers and researchers who wish to have, courageous conversations about race and about CRT in public spaces? And I'm also going to add on just, a tad to that question, given Adriana's, last response around researchers, should be actively engaged in politics and in activism. Now, I imagine, there might be a lot of, students in the audience now, graduate students, being trained in psychology or educational psychology, where there's this sort of dogma around being objective and, not engaging in politics and, activism, scholarship activism as like not real research. So I think that's a real tension for them. So yeah, if we could speak to that a bit, but then also think about, what advice we might have for teachers and other researchers who want to engage in some of these courageous conversations around CRT. The smiles,
I mean, I just spoke, so I was trying to not speak directly after I just spoke. but
Do it.
But you're speaking now, so you should.
all right,
you should
I
so-
unmuted. I moved first. You know, this myth of objectivity is just so old and tired. Like, no one's objective. Objective is not a thing. And so I think that's the primary thing that I try to remember and reinforce, is that we can be rigorous. We can be, ethical, right? These are goals in your research. We can be consistent. We can be thorough. In our research, we can do a lot of things, but the idea that you could be objective, it's a epistemological stance, ontology, or whatever you want to call it, that from my own ontological stance, I don't believe is possible. And so I think one thing that you can do if this is a struggle or something you're curious or engaging with in your own self, is even just explore what is the idea of objectivity. Even something as simple as kindergartners need to know how to count to 10 is not objective. It's a subjective belief that that's an important skill for a 5-year-old to have. And so anything that we're teaching in the classroom at any particular age, and you can say, well, research then shows that when kids know this does X, Y, and Z. And that's the same basis for teaching about race and racism, right? Research shows when kids know X, Y, and Z at different ages, they have these benefits. And so you begin to put evidence behind that belief that supports that belief. It's still not, I believe it's still not objective, so to speak, but that you have evidence that support the practice. And so that's kind of, I guess, for teachers and also for researchers, right? Like, we all have some sort of level of care about what we're studying. And perhaps we don't. Perhaps we just love to see the regression run and we don't care which variables are where, right? But somebody cares enough to write the intro and the result, like the discussion section about those connections of variables. So even deciding what variables go in the regression, right, is not objective. And so I would just encourage you all to lean away from even this idea that it's possible. I think you would then give yourself other rigorous research standards to attend to that really matter for good research and providing that evidence to support what we may believe are important parts of youth development, are important parts of learning. Well, let's see, like, how important are they actually? We can ask and answer research questions to determine that.
So I'm going to
Anyone
flip
else
it on
wanna jump
its
in?
head.
Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
No, so I'm gonna because that's what my mind works in, these weird kind of dualities. I like looking at both sides of it. And I think one of the difficulties that we as scholars always have is that, we're trying to pursue truth. We're trying to look for that objective reality, but we forget in the public discourse, we may be kind of in the muck and like, I'm so immersed in sociological theories of race right now. And is Joe Fagan right? Or is Bonilla Silva right? Or is it, you forgot about Patricia Hill Collins? I mean, there's all these different debates about what is the nature of it, that we forget that in the public discourse, we're talking about, is race relevant or is it not? And so I may not be able to say objectively that this is the specific theory of racism that is absolutely objectively correct, but I can say that the people who are attacking critical race theory, who are trying to promote a colorblind version or a race averse version of society, are objectively wrong. And I think we can actually co-opt the objectivity component by focusing on that. That, like, look, we continually, there's like this, our scholarly ethos gets thrown against us. Like, well, then prove your stance that race matters. But we don't ask the question, prove your stance that race doesn't matter. We just sort of accept it and we go on. We're constantly playing defense instead of offense. By that same token, I think that there is a lot of fear around acting as it pertains to this. And keep in mind, I've seen folks go through the rough and tumble. I've had friends and colleagues lose their jobs. I've had people get death threats. I've had people have their windows smashed in. And this was around the Mexican American studies stuff 12 years ago. Death threats, all sorts of stuff. And me as the stupid statistician over on the side, you know, in my first public commentary about it, I came back and someone had taken a knife and crossed out my nameplate in my office. So, you know, I understand that the effects are real, but I think the only thing that I'd say to that is we're trying to pursue this truth and trying to find what is in the objective reality, whether we believe in objectivity or not. Again, we have to reframe questions, because all too often people ask the question, what is the consequence of my action? If I'm going to engage, if I'm going to use CRT, if I'm going to be race forward in my work, in my teaching, or if I'm teaching teachers, if I'm doing this in my scholarship or my public scholarship, people always ask, well, you know, I might get this blowback, I might get this. We forget, again, flipping it on its head, what is the consequence of inaction? And I think, again, that's the core questions about that. We don't put them in the defensive for making them prove their objective reality. And we all too often are afraid to act, but forget about that there are consequences to our own inactions. That I think a lot of this is just sort of reframing a lot of these debates and making sure that we're looking at both sides of these equations, because it's very easy to psych yourself out and to think that you're not, you know, well, you know, I'm just going to stay on the sidelines for this one. And I know you can't fight every fight, but it becomes an excuse for inaction. But we forget that our own inaction has consequences, and those consequences are being manifest right now. That is our own inaction and our own inability to really defend race conscious policies on a systemic level, or why we're dealing with this white lash in the contemporary times. So that's kind of, again, how I keep flipping things on their heads and try to offer that complementary analysis to the previous question.
All right, appreciate that. I'm gonna move us forward just in the interest of time. We only have a little bit left, and so I'm gonna ask one more question, maybe one or two, if you can respond to it, and then we'll try and jump into a couple of questions that have been provided in Q&A. So my last question is, you know, what's the importance of teacher identity in this work? So do teachers need to do identity work before they engage? Do they do identity work while engaging it? Does identity development come after the fact, after they've acted into this work? So just some thoughts or reflections, comments on that.
Yes.
Can I jump? Yes, right. I want to echo what both Nolan and Alon mentioned in the previous question, and I'll get to answer this prompt, but first I wanted to give some reflections on the previous one, mainly because I wanted to come back to the part of the question of how do teachers and researchers, how do we prepare them for engaging in courageous conversations? One, I want to broaden our conceptualization of teachers to more like educators. I work with folks that are not in a classroom, but are educating young people around race and racism. And also as an educator in higher ed, I've come to learn that because of race-evasive ideology, which is dominant in the US, regardless of your identity, most folks, unless they've had some educational intervention or their families or communities have really instilled a comfort level with the discomfort about discussing race, people are gonna avoid conversations about race and racism. That is like, I think, baseline assumption for me as an educator, that often I have to build comfort around discomfort and to have students really think about where is that discomfort coming from. This is where the positionality and identity comes up. And for me, I really like to think more about positionality. Yes, our identities matter, and there needs to be some identity exploration, identity critical reflection involved throughout the process. But really, what imposes meaning to our identities are systems of power. And those systems of power will position us to take action. And I think it's also important to, again, think about where's my discomfort coming from? How have my identities positioned me in a way to either benefit or be a target of systems of oppression? How am I entering this space in conversation with others? Am I taking up too much space? Am I not talking? And why am I not voicing my opinions? Have I been silenced in the past? Have my thoughts put me in danger? Am I in a position to take more risks in collective action? Or am I someone that should be leading from behind? So I think all of that is really important. I don't think courageous conversations should be the end goal, but it's an essential skill to be actively engaged in anti-racism and racial justice.
Appreciate that, Adriana. So with our last few minutes, I believe there's 1 or 2 questions in the Q&A. So this first question, I just asked the panelists to comment on the impact of CRT discourse on refugee and immigrant children in our schools. Are we further ostracizing that population by putting forward CRT in our work with local schools and families?
These are the questions that I really struggle with, because we're not the ones who are putting CRT. We're not the ones who are creating a discourse around CRT. I hesitate to say that people who are doing race conscious work are in any way ostracizing, these schools and families and students of these specific marginalized identities. I kind of reject the basic premise of the question, because it's the general propaganda that's being engaged on a national level that's creating a more predatory environment, that sees these students as the other, whether they're in terms of migrants, some sort of invader, and in terms of refugees, potentially quote unquote terrorists. But again, they're always othered in some way, and to even begin engaging that comment by saying that in some way we're furthering that ostracization, it completely ignores the larger context of how this propaganda is being put forth. It completely ignores how they've been systemically othered. I mean, there was a Muslim ban, and we're going to build the wall and make Mexico pay for it. Kids in cages and the horrors that occur on a regular basis. And to sit there and say that in some way people who are putting forth a race conscious way of doing education are in any way responsible for that, I think we really need to rethink the assumptions that are embedded in that question in the first place.
I really appreciate your comments, Nolan, and I have a short anecdote that kind of speaks to that. So I'm currently in a revise and resubmit process for a co-authored paper where we're looking at the role of white supremacy as both like the function and actually I should say family separation as both function and result of white supremacy, resulting in trauma, immigration-related trauma. And we were looking specifically at immigration policy and its effect on family and children. We were not focusing at all at Latinx folks or even a specific population in the border now. But one of the comments from editors was that because most of the folks in the southern border, they assume, are quote unquote Latinx, Latinx, whatever you want to call them, that they're an ethnicity and that they mostly self-identify per the Pew Hispanic Center as quote unquote white, that a racial analysis of this issue would be inappropriate. And I think this really speaks to, again, this idea that race is a individual level issue, that race is not socially constructed, and that groups that are quote unquote not considered a racial group aren't experiencing racism, without acknowledging the white supremacy kind of underlines of our immigration policy throughout history, right? And so again, it's not CRT that is creating the ostracization. Actually, CRT gives us the lens and the tools to problematize the way that we speak about immigration, the impacts of immigration, and how white supremacy is functioning within the immigration policies.
All right, I appreciate that. So we're at time, but I'm moderating, so I'm gonna throw one more question in there. And hopefully we can just address it in a couple of minutes. So the question is from Trisha Alexander, and she asks, thinking about the analogy to the growth of Nazism historically, do you see the young minds in our society, minoritized or non-minoritized, as victims of propaganda?
Um, I I kind of want to pull a Adriana and kind of also just add to the last
Cycle back.
question.
Yeah, go for
Right?
it.
That it's also really anti-Black to think about, right? See, I think CRT, I think it's fundamentally anti-Black in thinking race isn't, and race and racism isn't just something that affects Black folks, and it's not ubiquitous that it's a Black and white, right? There's a lot of ways that internalized racism and all things interplay throughout communities. So I just kind of want to also reinforce that, refugee and immigrant children in schools are coming from a variety of racialized backgrounds. And for kids who have been here and who are in those schools receiving those students, for students who are coming and being received, a broader understanding of race and racism and how it functions here benefits everybody. And then, yes, I mean, victims, I think we all, it's literally how our country works. It's literally how the world works. And so victims of, is it the air we just breathe every day? All of us, right? I don't know if I would call it victims of propaganda, but I think we all need to think critically about what we're told is up and what we're told is down, and how that aligns with our actual experiences.
I also think there's an underlying irony of the situation. If you really look at a lot of the right wing, I know it probably propaganda is my buzzword of the day. But I mean, I subscribe to the Heritage Foundation as they're attacking CRT, and I know their talking points, and I know their playbook. I've seen this play out in David Horowitz's work in the Academic Bill of Freedom, Bill of Rights in the late 1990s. I've seen the ostracization of specific faculty members for being race conscious and creating professor watch lists and all these different things. And what's ironic about this is that the ultimate people who are the purveyors of this propaganda are the ones who are doing it under the guise of quote unquote making sure that students aren't indoctrinated. And they co-opt the terminology of critical thinking, of indoctrination. It started off very much along the lines of attacking what they saw as liberal and leftist indoctrination in higher education, and now it's moving to K-12. And so, pretty much if you see people sitting there saying that students are being indoctrinated into leftist views, that's one of the very first indications that propaganda is occurring. And then the problem is that when you have people in authority who are saying just ridiculous comments that have literally no basis in reality, like even, and I'm not trying to valorize the Reagan Revolution, but at least he and Tip O'Neill could kind of have a conversation about that. This is the reality. Here's my conservative point. Here's my liberal point. This is like, hey, this grass is green. Hey, the grass is blue. I mean, that's the level of the discourse that we're having right now. And it puts us as academics in really weird spaces, because usually we're kind of like used to having debates where there's at least some semblance of truth. And in these situations, there's not. The truth is that these are intentional methods of propaganda that are meant to solidify both white and Republican political power. That's, at the end of the day, it's what it is. It's a power-based analysis. And I think we need to really be careful about how we engage in that, because in many respects, as Patricia Alexander is saying, or at least there's an implication of the question, that our students' minds and their very bodies are at stake in the process, because it's not just like someone's spouting off propaganda, but it's being very much validated by a great deal of the population. And once propaganda becomes validated, as Alon was saying, then it becomes an excuse to do harm. I am not sitting here beating up a brown person on the US-Mexico border. I am stopping an invasion from happening. It's the first step to the othering that allows the violence to happen. And part of our goal as truth tellers is to disrupt the propaganda as a preemptive way of getting around the violence, so that our students are not subjected to so much of the violence that is inevitable. I mean, the tidal wave is coming, and they're already subjected to a great deal of violence, but it can get a lot worse. And so in many respects, our stopgap measures need to be along those lines.
All right, so I just appreciate the panelists for the really lively discussion. I had high expectations and it exceeded those. So So thank you all. I know we can't see the rest of the audience, but I wish we could, just do an applause or, some sort of Zoom chat love, but I'm not sure we can do that. But I will transition over to Mecca, who's going to make a few announcements as we close out.
Well, thank you everyone for such a powerful discussion. And we hope that we can continue this discussion at the conference in Minneapolis. August 6th is the session on race at 3 o'clock. It is the attack of critical race theory and our role as educational psychologists. And it will be in the Convention Center at 3 again on August 6th. And we look forward to engaging in more discussion. We want to thank everyone for embracing in this moment issues surrounding race and racism from an educational research perspective and a psychological perspective. And thanks to you, Jamal, for leading such a wonderful discussion with this panel. We want to thank Adriana, Elan, and Nolan from the Race and Diversity Committee from Division 15 for APA, which is led by Dr. Jessica Ducour Gumby. So we look forward to engaging in more discussion, and thanks again, everyone.